Hi everybody, this is Josh Culp. We are learning Daf Kaf Heh of Masechet Gittin. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of Breira and particularly reflect a little bit on Rashi's comments, on one of Rashi's comments on Breira. So the concept of Breira is what I call retroactive determination, retroactive clarification. Something is indeterminate at a particular moment, and then later on it becomes determined. Can we go back to that earlier moment and say that it was determined at that moment? So the easiest example is for the get. If a husband writes, I will give the get to whichever of you I so choose, the Mishnah says the woman he eventually gives the get to is not divorced, because the Mishnah holds that we don't hold by the principle of Breira, retroactive determination. We don't say that later on, let's say he made that statement on Sunday, and then Tuesday he gave it to one of his wives who has the two of them have the same name. We don't say that retroactively it was determined that he wanted to give it to the wife he gave it to. Rather, we would say in the beginning it wasn't written explicitly for either wife, and therefore it can't be divorced. She can't be divorced by it because we need the get to be written for her sake. Now, I wanted to point out an interesting moment in our sugya. The concept of Breira comes up in a whole bunch of sources. Many of them are here in our sugya. And Abaye at some point in the middle of the sugya over here points out that there could be a difference between what he calls toleh b'dat acherim and toleh b'dat atzmo, making the retroactive choice dependent upon another person and making the retroactive choice dependent upon the person. And Rashi explains that when you're toleh b'dat atzmo, when you make it dependent on yourself, you had that ability at that moment to make the decision. The husband who's giving one of two wives a divorce could decide at that moment which of those two wives he wants to divorce. And therefore, the fact that he doesn't means that we can't really go back and say, or at least according to Abaye, we can't go back and say that retroactively it was determined that this was the woman he wanted to divorce, this was the wife he wanted to divorce, because he could have. Right? Rashi uses the wonderful phrase, poseach al shtei seifim. He's jumping on two clauses, meaning he's being very wishy-washy, and he could have made the decision, but he didn't. On the other hand, toleh b'dat acherim, when you make something dependent upon other people, well, in that case, well, yeah, he didn't have to make it dependent on anybody, his action, but at times, like, a person might not have a choice. And we may be able to say, like, look, if something is dependent on somebody else and there was no choice in the matter, then that isn't really a disqualifying act of Breira. It's just we didn't know at the moment what the real status was going to be. And therefore, later on, we can say that it retroactively clarifies what the status was. I think the best example of that might be the case of a division of property, where we say that earlier it was as if it was already divided in order to avoid certain negative results. You can look through the sugya to see that. So it's an interesting discussion. Rava disagrees. Rava thinks that Breira is absolute, either that you hold that you can go back retroactively or you don't. But Abaye brings up that interesting point of distinguishing between a case of somebody making his statement dependent on others, which might be possible, versus somebody making his statement depending on himself.